Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Wilson, also known as Milady Vivlon, and I'm here today with Jim Penton, who's a good friend of mine and someone I knew when I was a witness, and he was a witness back in the 80s. I remained a Jehovah's Witness until about 5 years ago, approximately, but Jim ran afoul of the organization back in the early 80s, and his story is actually a very encouraging one for all of us who have stood firm for truth and been willing to take a stand despite the consequences of doing so by what has become even more so now than I think ever before, a repressive organization. And so I wanted to ask Jim exactly what transpired that caused him to eventually leave the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses and how that came about. So Jim, could you tell us how it all started?
Yes, I think I would have left much earlier than I actually did. But in the early 1970s, the Watchtower entered a phase wherein they were less severe in disfellowshipping and treating disfellowshipped persons, and they were regulating the district and circuit overseers who were just to be treated as other elders and not to have dictatorial powers.
I remember that.
And so I stuck with the organization during that period of the early 1970s because I really felt that maybe the organization would reform and move into a new phase.
Right.
But one thing was very wrong, and that was that there was great attention placed in Watchtower literature and by Watchtower officials about the year 1975.
Right.
Now, my mother-in-law, who was living with me and my wife, went to a district convention that year. That was in the 1960s, late 1960s, I believe it was 66, and brought home a book which focused on 1975. Now, she said, well, the society is saying that the end may come in 1975. And I said, oh, that has to be nonsense. And I went into the bedroom, looked at this book, looked at the particular passages that dealt with this, and was so annoyed that I threw the book on the bed and said to myself, won't these damn fools ever learn? Now, when nothing happened in 1975, the Watchtower Society began to act as though it wasn't its fault or the fault of the governing body that was in charge of affairs by that time.
Yeah, we did nothing wrong.
We did nothing wrong. It was you brothers out in the rest of the world who were too excited about 1975 and didn't use judgment.
Right.
Now, I found this just absolutely disgusting, and it was 3 years later before they gave any sort of apology for what had happened.
And it wasn't much of one, if memory serves.
That's right. It wasn't much of one that didn't serve at all. Now, I also became very concerned about something else. In studying the scriptures, I came to realize that there was no command to go from house to house, as the Watchtower Society had held since early in the presidency of J.F. Rutherford. And so I felt that I had to do something, and I was working on a history of Jehovah's Witnesses at that time, and I went down to Brooklyn to discuss some of these concerns that I had with some of the governing body. I didn't talk to any of them particularly, but Raymond Franz, who recognized that what I was saying was really true. But he was hoping, against hope, I think, that there would be reforms made. And of course, that wasn't to happen.
No.
I talked to other persons at the Brooklyn Bethel, some old timers, and there was a great deal of dissent at Watchtower headquarters at that time. And people were feeling very, very badly used by certain members of the governing body. Well, I returned home and I felt that I had to write a letter. And the reason for this letter was that they were stressing door-to-door preaching because many witnesses had fallen away over 1975.
If I could interject, even now they stress it in the reference Bible. If you look up those scriptures of house to house, they quote 3 scholarly works to support their belief. But if you look up the actual work that they cite and read the part they didn't list, you find out that in each case, the person is actually arguing against house-to-house working. They've extracted only a little part that seems to support the doctrine and left the rest out.
Yes, they quoted out of context. And this is what they did in the 15th of July, 1979 Watchtower. And I read that when I was at the headquarters of the Watchtower Society. And I was so shocked by this because they bobbed off part of a quotation from Professor Robertson. And I thought this was certainly nothing short of dishonesty, which I still think it was. And I remember being shown through the library with a couple who were from France. And my French wasn't very good. I got a little of the conversation, but not much. And suddenly I made a remark that I had spent some time in Spain. And the young couple that were there as pioneers from France said, "Oh, do you know Spanish?" And so I spoke to them in Spanish, and we carried on our discussion there. And I mentioned what was in the 1979 July 15th Watchtower, and they were both shocked. The husband in particular was so shocked over this. He said, "It can't be that way." And I said, "Yes, that's what they're saying." Well, I went home. At that time, I was living in Alberta, Canada, and I sat down and I wrote a long letter to the society, and I dealt with the question of 1975, and I said, "You are blaming the brothers out in the field, and you are responsible for this and should admit the facts." Secondly, I pointed to the watchtower that I was just discussing and pointed out that they had cut off or bobbed off the statement by the professor that was quoted in the organization book from 1972, and this was hypocritical. I didn't use that word, but I certainly implied that that was what was happening. And I stated to them in a discussion in looking at the Greek and the meaning of house to house or door to door, which it wasn't door to door, it was house to house, which undoubtedly meant in the houses. And the Apostle Paul wasn't going down the street offering Watchtower magazines to the Greeks of his day. He was teaching people in the houses of Christians. And he was going to the various houses of Christians. And it was a teaching work, not a preaching work, as the term door to door implies to Jehovah's Witnesses.
Right.
Well, that was the cause of my end with Jehovah's Witnesses.
Mm-hmm. Just to interrupt you there, there's a book that was written by a assistant professor of the Atlantic Baptist College named James Penton, and he did research independently into that whole, it became known internationally actually, called Crisis of Allegiance, and this book details in all that went on. It's really quite a shocking account of religious repression, really. Go on, Jim.
Yes, and what happened, of course, was that inadvertently this letter, I had discussed some of my concerns with a sister in the congregation, and she and another sister sat in on my classes at the University of Lethbridge. I'm a trained academic. I have an undergraduate degree from the University of Arizona and graduate degrees, master's and doctorate from the University of Iowa. And consequently, these sisters came to listen to one of my classes. I was teaching a class in religious studies, and the one sister said that anything that I had written or was about to write, she would like to examine. The next week, she wasn't there. She was sick. And she died not too long after that. But the other sister who was there, I said, would you take this letter to Ethel? That was her name. And she said, sure. Well, she opened the letter, read it, gave it to her husband, who ran to some of the elders in another congregation. And the next thing I knew, the Watchtower Society was coming down on me. The circuit and district overseer were quite unpleasant, and the district servant said to me in so many words, the society, the governing body has said if you don't go along with what the society is teaching about house to house, then you are to be disfellowshipped. Well, I don't think the Canadian branch wanted to disfellowship me because I had written an earlier book on Jehovah's Witnesses in Canada.
I remember that.
Which was quite favorable to Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yes.
And it had some mistakes in it because in introducing the book, I used some of the Watchtower's own propaganda about what had happened in the First World War. But in the main, I had dealt with the question of civil liberties and the importance of Jehovah's Witnesses cases before the Supreme Court. And I don't apologize for having written what I did there because I had studied that carefully. But they decided, apparently, simply to remove me as an elder so that I would be ineffective. A committee was struck and they listened to the whole conversation, and they decided that I wasn't an apostate at that time. But curiously, they left the question of whether I should be left as an elder or not to the circuit overseer and to certain elders in the congregation who were very opposed to me. 3 brothers voted against that, or I believe I'm wrong on that. I think it was 2 brothers voted against that. And they decided to remove me as an elder. Well, I knew that they were playing games with me, and so I refused to go back to the Kingdom Hall, and quite a number of brothers and sisters supported me. My son had already received reprimands from the circuit overseer because he was going to university, working towards a bachelor's degree in mathematics and let's see, what was the other one? Mathematics and I'm not sure just what the other degree was or the other major was for him, but he had been very helpful to a local congregation of brothers who were really fine people, and they really appreciated him. He did a great deal with the electrical programs that were at the assemblies. He had taught classes to some backward brothers in the congregation. He was a ministerial servant, and he was working late in the afternoon and evening to keep his family together. But when the circuit overseer came, he decided that because David had gone to university, he was to be reprimanded for this, and it was stated that in his report to the Watchtower Society that if he didn't up his hours of service, he would be removed as a ministerial servant. And
the all-important hours.
Yes. The all-important hours, even though there were a couple of elders in the congregation who had fewer hours than he did. And the brothers said to him, well, don't pay any attention to him. We'll front for you. They were good men. But by that time, David came to question the whole business of reporting, service, in the door-to-door work. And he said, that's all right. I don't want to stay anyway. And so he and his wife walked out. And they resigned. And it wasn't until after the explosion at Brooklyn the next year that the society decided that if someone left the organization peacefully, they were to be regarded as apostates and shunned completely.
Right. The infamous disassociation.
Infamous disassociation, yes, that's right. And so I was blamed as a professor. He was blamed as a university student, a brilliant student, graduated with great distinction, as did my daughter, and my other son later on was very successful in university. And we felt that this was the way to make a living, and that it was nobody's business whether our children went to university or didn't go to university. It was up to them, and not up to some group of men in Brooklyn, New York, to tell us how to educate our children or to encourage our grown children to
Something
go on.
they're still doing.
That's right.
Even more so now than ever.
That's right.
I had a question regarding that. Now, you said that a number left. Do you remember roughly how many left with you?
About 83 persons.
So it's like a significant congregation that left.
That's right. There were 3 congregations in the city at the time, and roughly a third of the witnesses in the city left.
Wow.
And many of them are still very happy that they have left the doors closed to the Watchtower Society and Jehovah's
But if I get it
Witnesses.
right, they left, but they didn't leave Christ.
Oh no.
They continued to worship God and serve our Lord, but without the dogma of the Watchtower.
That's right. That's right. And we called ourselves Free Bible Students, by the way. And
which is a good name, because the one thing I've found in leaving is a sense, very overwhelming sense of freedom, such as I've never had before.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Leaving is such a welcome event, although the stress that I underwent during the period that the whole matter was to be dealt with was terrible. And then
it's hard to have people that you look up to and respect suddenly turn against you and accuse you of the most horrendous disloyalty.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And then, because we organized a congregation that was separate from the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses, I was labeled a heretic.
Right.
And what they used was the English term for heretic, and that is the creator of a sect separate from them.
Mm-hmm.
And after quite a while, they decided to send out a representative from Ontario to Alberta to organize a meeting to disfellowship me. I decided not to go. My son advised me, and I decided not to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I stayed home. But quite a number of the brothers and sisters who had supported me went to the Kingdom Hall to testify on my behalf. But they were sent into a separate room and not really allowed to say anything. So they got up and walked out.
Mm.
The meeting apparently went on for about 3 hours.
Mm.
And some of the people had come over to our house, and some said, well, let's go back there and see what's going on. And lo and behold, there was a young man outside who had been taking pictures for, as I learned, the Alberta Report magazine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I had nothing to do with this. I didn't intend this at all, but a brother in the United States had put the magazine, the Alberta Report, made them aware of the fact that I was going to be disfellowshipped. So they had sent out a photographer to take pictures. Well, they told him to get off their sidewalk, and so he moved off to the sidewalk and was on public property, and they left him alone for a while, and he stood there for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
At about the time they were ready to come out of the Kingdom Hall, my son and some of the other witnesses or ex-witnesses came over to see what was going on, why things had lasted this long. And suddenly they came streaming out, and one witness, an elder from one of the other congregations, and a man who was my son's brother-in-law, started chasing this young man who was taking pictures and screaming and yelling like a banshee going down the road. And the young fellow was so frightened that he crossed the river, went into the University of Lethbridge, and locked himself in.
Wow.
And he was terribly frightened. On top of this, my son said, leave the man alone. He has a legal right to be here.
Mm-hmm.
One fellow coming out of the Kingdom Hall came up to my son and punched him.
Wow.
Well, he was a man in his 50s or early 60s, and my son, who has a quick temper, responded by hitting him in the face, and down he went and ended up in the hospital with a cracked cheekbone.
Wow.
The witnesses called the police and tried to state that my son had started this first.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the man was honest enough to admit that he had struck my son first, and so the police refused to prosecute.
Mm.
And it was at that point that a great many said, no more Watchtower, no more Awake, no more Jehovah's Witnesses.
They could see the conduct, the fruits, as Jesus said, is what really reveals where there is spirit or not.
That's right. That's right. And I remember looking at a Watchtower magazine some years later where they made the remark that, they couldn't put dissenters to death because that wasn't permitted under the new covenant, but they were to consider apostates in effect dead.
Yes.
dead to God.
Mm-hmm.
And they were speaking for God rather than let him make the decision.
Yes.
And really, since that time, I have studied and become more liberated, gradually more liberated, and more in tune with what I think primitive Christianity was all about.
So, for the sake of the many out there who are now going through one version or another of what you went through all those decades ago, what advice can you give them, not only to get through this period of tribulation, but also what hope is there once you get through it?
Well, what people have to realize when they leave the Watchtower organization is this. This organization does not reflect the teachings of Jesus Christ or the early church.
Mm-hmm.
It is an hierarchical organization which I have looked at carefully and compared in print to the Roman Catholic hierarchy. And I think that's right. They rule with a rod of iron, and they constantly change doctrines. And if you're not in tune with the latest doctrine, they're willing to cut you off.
Mm-hmm.
And many are being cut off over personal matters, over their lifestyles. And if they ever question anything that this organization says, and they question it openly, then it's off with your head.
Right.
This reminds me of the Inquisition.
Mm-hmm.
Of the Catholic Church. And what is interesting here on this is the matter of disfellowshipping. They claim that they have provisions in dealing with people who are apostates. But in fact, since the 1940s, they have never had any open meetings before witnesses to allow some form of justice to be done. The backroom judicial committees of the Watchtower Society are simply inquisitions, and that cannot be denied by anyone. One is not usually permitted to have any witnesses, although the organization says they are.
Yeah.
They are not permitted to have anything recorded. There are no minutes taken, and
no observers are allowed.
No observers are allowed,
Mm-hmm.
and you are treated like a criminal. You are held to be guilty before you can be proven innocent, and seldom can you be proven innocent.
I believe the only example of this type of judicial process in the Bible is the trial of Jesus by the Sanhedrin.
That's right. That's right.
Very similar.
And the attempted trials of the Sanhedrin of the Apostles.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And there's nothing like this. In ancient Israel, men sat at the gates of the city where people were passing by, and they would deal with cases where justice had to be done.
Mm-hmm.
But it was open.
Right.
And we are told that if there are matters that are of concern, ultimately they are to be taken to the congregation.
Right.
But unfortunately, so many Jehovah's Witnesses, and I don't like the use of this term, but I'm going to use it anyway, are brainwashed,
Mm-hmm.
that they will act like a mob
Mm-hmm.
for persons who are to be disfellowshipped. That occurred many, many years ago. The branch overseer of Canada was dealt with in that fashion. And if you read the Watchtower account of how he was cut off from the organization, it sounds like a mob dealing with a man.
I actually wrote an article on both the Mullen case and the Salter case a number of years ago, which I will put a link to it in the description of this video. It's in English, but there is a translation utility that will allow anyone in another language to also view it.
That's wonderful, Eric. I really appreciate that. You're doing such a great work, and I want to be with you in that great work of bringing comfort. And I particularly want to assure one group who have left Jehovah's Witnesses over various reasons, who are suffering perhaps more than most of us men. And that's our dear sisters who have been treated so disrespectfully. Can you imagine women of any age, but particularly young women, being forced to go in and be dealt with by a group of older men who have very little understanding of the problems of young women? I find this just deceitful and disgusting.
Yes.
And I want to work as a brother in Christ with Eric and with others to help bring not only freedom, but love to those who are bruised and beaten by an organization which is not of God or not of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Jim, for sharing that information with us. I'll put contact information in the description of the video as well. So we welcome any emails that you would like to send. And please subscribe to this video and share it if you can. And feel free to make comments as well. Thank you, one and all.
And thank you from me.
So if you enjoyed that discussion and want to know more, first there's a book called Crisis of Allegiance, which I mentioned earlier, which is available, I think, still on Amazon.com. And also, or if you can't get it there, send me an email and I might be able to get you a few extra copies. Also, there is a new book, Jehovah's Witnesses and the Third Reich, which is quite a thick tome, an excellent discussion of the history of Jehovah's Witnesses in the Third Reich, and you'll learn a lot that you won't find in Watchtower publications. And finally, of course, the well-known Apocalypse Delayed. James wrote that as well. It's the story of Jehovah's Witnesses. It's in its third edition now, also available on Amazon.